Okay, I think you're ready, Héctor?
We are ready.
I think all the people are there. So let's start. Okay, good morning, everybody. We are very pleased to have this seminar that was arranged by Professor Héctor Rocha, and we invited Charles Wookey. Charles Wookey is the CEO of Blueprint for Better Business. This is a UK based not-for-profit organization whose purpose is to help create better society through better business. Something that, as you know, it's deeply related to IAE's mission. It was founded by him and others in 2014, and Charles has been, since then, the CEO. The organization works mostly with leaders in large UK-based multinationals, and in the years since it started, Blueprint has established a reputation of, as a one corporate CEO put it in these terms, you got gold standards of what purpose-led business should be. As well as working with corporate leaders, Blueprint also engaged with business school. For example, in 2016, there was a key point when Blueprint organized an interdisciplinary academic conference at London Business School, inviting Professor Rebecca Henderson from Harvard Business School. Also, Charles has been invited to teach an elective course at Sachs Business School in Oxford with Professor Colin Mayer for the past 5 years. He also studied at Oxford University. He studied physics, philosophy, and theology, and is qualified as a chartered accountant in KPMG. Prior to Blueprint, Charles has worked at the House of Commons for an economic think tank, and also for some years for the Cardinal Archbishop of Westminster. So welcome, Charles, and Héctor, I leave the questions for you.
Well, thank you very much, Rodolfo, for this introduction. Thank you, Charles, for sharing this webinar with us in the middle of this pandemic. It's good news to share this webinar about business as a force for good, especially now in Argentina, the time we are just having here. This is meant to be a time for reflection, and Charles has shared with us, with IAE, since 2017, his time. So thank you for this twice. This is the second time. This is a webinar for reflection and action. And you have received the invitation with 4 questions. So what we are doing is not PowerPoint presentations. You will see in the chat the link to the website of Blueprint for Better Business. And then we'll have the webinar around these 4 questions. We will start now. And just one thing is about your questions. In previous webinars, in general, people start talking, writing comments about the webinar. In case you have a question, just do that. In case you have a question, just write in capital letters question and then your question. So I will follow the chat, and when we end the presentation, then we'll start the conversation with you. So I will start with the first questions to Charles. It's related, okay, business as a force for good, but what does good mean for you and the work you are doing? And then we are going to the other questions.
Okay, well, thank you, Hector, and thank you, Rodolfo, for that kind introduction. And it is a great pleasure to be with you all. I'm sorry I don't speak Spanish, so you have to cope with my English. I'll try and speak slowly, though, because I tend to speak very quickly. Not as quickly as I see native Spanish speakers. I don't understand how anybody understands anybody else, the speed with which I hear Spanish spoken. So I don't do that. So, I will try. Okay, so the answer, I think, is it means business is itself part of society, not separate from society, and that it has a role, fundamental role, to benefit society through all its activities. This is what I think business as a force for good is. And in our work, we think that there are two key elements needed for this to happen. First, business needs to see itself as having a purpose, a reason for being, which describes the positive impact in the world that arises from its success, from what it does and how it does it. So purpose, profit, of course, is important for business, but profit in this way of thinking is an outcome and not the purpose. So in the same way, governments need to raise taxes. We don't say that taxes are the purpose of government. Charities need to raise donations, but we don't say donations are the purpose of charities. Business without profit dies, but it doesn't mean that profit is the purpose of business and the reason people in business get out of bed in the morning. And this is very important because it has been a very dominant way of thinking about business. So that's one idea, purpose. The second is that businesses are social organizations. They are a series of human relationships, and their impact in society has a lot to do with the quality of those relationships. And as we think of it, a purpose-led business is one that cares about people. And it's one that seeks to have a positive impact on the lives of all those who are touched by the business, whether they are employees or customers or suppliers. And we have a phrase that each person is a someone, not a something. So a human-centered approach. Now, when you put these two ideas together, that business can have a purpose that benefits society where profit is an outcome, and that a business is a social organization, a human system, this is where the power lies, because what then happens is that you unlock the potential of people to commit beyond self-interest to a shared worthwhile endeavor. So people will, not just employees, but customers, suppliers, communities will want to work with an organization that they feel is making a positive contribution to society. So there is a win for the business and there's a win for society at the same time. And the thinking behind Blueprint draws on some of the principles of Catholic social thought, but you find these in other faiths and philosophies as well, around human dignity and the common good. And these kind of ways of thinking underpin our whole approach. So it comes from society rather than from business. And we describe it as embodied in wisdom traditions. And the way Blueprint thinks is that we have two pieces of paper. Each of them took 1 year to write. So we have a very poor production rate. And the first one is a framework which says, if you think this way about purpose and about people, here's how you behave. And the second says, okay, if you think about in that way, this is how you show up as an organization. So it's a relationship map for a business. Now, when we started, people said, okay, so why? Why should we be interested in purpose? What is the business case? And now they don't say that. Now I find people say, yeah, I get purpose is important. I want to know two things. How do you do this? How do you do it properly? And how do you know? How do you assess and measure your progress? For the businesses in London that we speak to, that's the question now. So why is that big change? I think several reasons. First of all, there are societal and environmental problems, which the old way of thinking about business in terms of maximizing profit does not solve, but makes worse. Secondly, corporate social responsibility. People don't think that that's meeting the need. Third, people, especially younger people, want to work for organizations that they feel have a positive impact on the world. They want to be proud of the organization. Another factor is social media. Companies cannot hide anymore. They can't say one thing and do another. It's obvious to everybody. Investors are increasingly also wanting and seeing the link between a purpose-led approach and long-term sustainable performance. So there's a push from investors, and there's growing evidence base now showing the link between purpose and performance. And final factor, I would say, is the SDGs, is climate change, is the fact that we have as a world these huge collective action problems, and the old ways of thinking are not going to deal with them. So that explains, I hope why what we see as business as a force for good and why we think this purpose movement is growing.
Right. Thank you, Charles, for your introduction. The framework is in the link I just put in the chat, the Blueprint, so then you can have a look at this. And the first question was about the why, and now the second is the how. The second question is, how to transform business from their inner mission beyond conventional approaches such as CSR. You have mentioned that one of the reasons why now people think about business and development and society is because several pressures, social pressure, social media, investors, SDGs, but one of them is a CSR. So how to transform this? How to go from convenience to conviction?
Yeah, so this is a great question. And what I'm going to say now just reflects our experience. So we mostly work with the CEOs and leadership teams of very large companies. It's a small number. Not everybody is interested in this. So I'm wary of generalizing to all companies from our own experience, but this is what we have found. I think the reason people come to us and want to work on this is because they have a sense that there is unrealized potential in their business, whether that's about human motivation, whether that's about reputation, whether it's about product innovation and meeting the needs coming their way. People see that there is a gap that they have that they want to fulfill. And what it needs, in our view, is a change from the CSR world, because the CSR world is we make our money over here and we do these nice good things over there. And this is about saying, let's bring these things completely together. So what's the core business about? And then what it needs is a real conversation in the executive team of the business about what the gap is and the belief, to come to a belief that this will create a better business and a better society. So by changing how we think about purpose and people, what is the business benefit from doing that? And it's essential then that it carries through. It's not a project, but it then has implications for the way in which businesses think about their culture, their strategy, and their governance. All of these things become important in the transformation to becoming a purpose-led business. It's not something that can just be led by the CEO who comes in and says, oh, we've got a nice new purpose. And then 5 years later, they go and someone else comes in and says, no, that's not the purpose. We're going somewhere else. That's hopeless. If this is going to be real, it has to be deeply founded in the identity of the business, which often means going back to its foundation and creating an articulation of its purpose, which endures through different leadership changes. So this is a big shift, and it has to be understood in those terms. Now, what creates, I think, the power of this? So why did people get interested and get excited, and what do they need in order to see? I think when Rodolfo and Héctor asked me this question, my answer is they need examples. What people in a business want is, often people are quite cynical. They've seen things before. They say, no, okay, I don't believe this will happen. So show me. So it's examples of change. So give you one example, simple one. A bank we've been working with, they used to be profit maximizing. They looked at their overdrafts and the income they got from their customers on unauthorized overdrafts. And they realized that 50% of the profit they were making was from 1% of their customers. So people who could not manage their money, the bank was doing wonderfully. People who are completely incapable, always going overdrawn, the bank was making lots and lots of money out of them. Now, if you get up in the morning and say our purpose is to maximize profit, whose problem is that? If you get up in the morning and say our purpose is that people should thrive, you have a problem. So what the bank did was to decide it would not take that money anymore, and it would completely reform the way it dealt with overdrafts. But that's a loss of revenue. So they have to innovate into other revenue. But that was a really good example where they decided to lose the money before they decided how they were going to replace it. And when you make a decision like that, you give people encouragement to feel that this is serious. Another example, in the COVID crisis, a company we are working with, which employs 70,000 people in the UK, a lot of low paid, 6,000 people just on the national minimum wage, so very low paid. They made a commitment in December that they were going to increase the pay of the bottom 6,000 to the real living wage, which is a big increase above the legal minimum. You then have the COVID crisis. So the question was, do they fulfill this obligation, the commitment that they had made, which they were going to do in April this year? And they decided they would. The only way they could fund it was by getting the senior team to agree to have a pay cut. So everybody who was earning over £70,000 a year took a proportionate pay cut, up to the chief executive who took a 25% pay cut. And that funded the pay increase for the 6,000 people at the bottom. and they decided to honor their commitment, and they did it. So that kind of example is a really powerful way of encouraging people to think that this is for real. A third example would be a mining company that we've also been working with, again, during the COVID crisis. And what they did was to look at the communities and ask the communities in which their mines were operating what they needed from the company and how the company could help them. They didn't ask the question, how can you help us? They asked, how can we help you? And in doing that, they created a whole bunch of things which have been very helpful in Southern Africa and elsewhere, where they have mines which have done more than would otherwise have been the case, and indeed done more than a lot of their competitors did. And they did it partly out of self-interest, but mainly because they want a long-term relationship. So those are some examples, I think, of what it means to do this in practice. We can talk more, if you like, about in the Q&A about what the steps you take in order to become purpose-led, but I hope that gives you some sense.
Yeah, sure. It's not theory, it's practice. And you are talking about multinationals. You are not talking about small businesses or charities. That's the important thing, that there will be many questions, I think, around that, because working on purpose with multinationals is quite difficult. But with the 3 examples you gave us, I think is enough to exemplify. So let's go to the third question, and it's just a transition to the public as well, to the audience, because it's what we could do from our role in our organization and society, in the place where we work now, to make this transformation possible. What is our role here? So maybe you will start with your own example, but then the idea is to make people think about what they can do on this.
Yeah, well, that's a great question as well. I mean, one of the things that we feel very strongly is that this kind of change is both an organizational challenge and a human personal challenge. In other words, I don't believe you can create a purpose-led business without people, individuals involved in the business, being personally committed to being part of that. So if people go in and say, oh yeah, it's up to them, they're going to do it, and I just turn up as myself, I don't think it will work that way. And the point is that we all, in fact, have a choice. Businesses have a choice about what their purpose is, and we all have a choice about how we show up. One of my heroes is the Czech dissident Václav Havel, who became the first president of the Czech Republic in 1989 after the fall of communism in Europe. And in one of his essays, when he was imprisoned in the 1970s, he writes about the responsibility and the choice that leaders have about what they appeal to in other people. And he says, do they appeal to their greed, to their fear, to their selfishness? Or do leaders appeal to people's selflessness, to their desire to contribute, to their desire for meaning? And he said, the kind of society you get depends on that choice made by politicians and political leaders and leaders in the media, but also leaders in business. And so the culture that's created within an organization is partly the result of a choice about what buttons are pressed, what people is appealed to in all of us. And of course, we are all complex, right? And we all have different motives, and we are all malleable. We will all shift who we are as human beings in different cultures and different businesses. We will try and fit in. And we all have self-interest, and we all have the capacity also to contribute if we really believe in what we're doing, if we believe everybody else does. So I think for me, there's something really powerful about the mindset that we choose to have and whether we want to contribute and lean into in this kind of way. And I'll just tell you one story. I was listening to a webinar last week with the HR director of a very large company. And she was saying, she just quoted the poet Maya Angelou. And she said, the way I think about it with my people is I just quote what Maya Angelou said. And this line from Maya Angelou was, people don't remember what you said, and they don't remember what you did, but they do remember how you made them feel, which I just think is a wonderful quote, right? And so that's a choice we've all got in business. And we all know, if you'll all know from your previous experience, the difference you have working in a team where you feel valued and respected, and everybody is, and working in a team where the boss does not respect people and where it's not human-centered. It's kind of obvious, but it's not obvious because the way in which cultures in organizations work can often squeeze out the humanity. And it's up to all of us to make sure that that doesn't happen in any business we work in.
Right. Well, thank you, Charles. So we started with the why. What does it mean be a force for good? Then the how, the practicalities. So you gave us 3 examples and the criteria underlying the examples. The third question was a call to action to us. And then the fourth one is starting from us as a university and as a IAE. So I will leave the fourth question to our dean, Rodolfo Rivarola. And the first question that people may hear, Nicolas, was about the role of universities and business schools in making business for good. But I will leave this last question to Rodolfo, and then we'll open the question to the public.
Okay. Thank you, Héctor. Charles, well, you know that IAE's mission, it's pretty well related to Blueprint mission. But as a business school that we teach, we transform using our alumni and alumnus. So the question is that how can you challenge we as IAE and me as Dean of IAE? Because if you tell me, I think we have been doing this for since we start, but looking for the results first in our country and how this business change, I think we are lacking something. So how you can challenge us about this?
Well, thank you, Rodolfo. I mean, it's a great question. I mean, and I've enjoyed the encounters I've had with Hector and with your colleagues at IEA so far. I believe strongly in the importance of business schools. I mean, business schools have a huge role to play in the system. You know, you do in Latin America and the big schools in the States and in the UK, these form future leaders. And so this is a very important thing. So my challenge to you would be, and I don't know enough about how you actually organize the curriculum and everything else, if you follow the logic of what I was saying about business, what is the job of a business school? Well, in my view, the job of the business school is to educate and form leaders of purpose-led businesses. So in the old model, lesson 1, day 1 in a business school, what is the job of the firm? Answer, to maximize shareholder value. Very good. So what do you need to know in order to lead a company that does that? Well, you need to understand strategy, marketing, cash, a whole bunch of things, right? Which are the normal curriculum. If you start somewhere else and say, lesson 1, day 1, what is the job of the firm? The answer is to benefit society through producing goods that are good, services that serve, and forming people, making money as an outcome. Okay, then the question is, if that's the job of the firm, what is the job of a leader? How do we think about the qualities of competence and character of somebody who's going to be brilliant at leading a purpose-led company? And that's where my challenge to you as a business school would be, to what extent do you see that as your job, your purpose, and to what extent are you doing that? And it's about giving people the experience and excitement. I think one of the problems I've seen is in the business schools in the UK is you have the normal curriculum, and then you have these add-on electives, which might be about business ethics, or they might be about purpose, or they might be about a number of other things. And then what you have is this mindset, okay, the core thing is here, this is the thing we're examined on, this is the thing really matters, and then you have all these other things, which are on the side. If you're interested in ethics, go and do an ethics course. And this won't work. To my mind, you have to have right in the core curriculum, right from the very beginning. So what is the strategy? How does our strategy follow from our purpose? How do we think about the non-financial outcomes as well as the financial outcomes that arise from our success? How do we think about what relationships we want to create within the company and outside the company if it's going to be truly human-centered? And these should be core. So that would be my challenge.
Okay. Great. Well, as always, our conversation with Charles challenged us. I hope that it challenged the audience as well. Rodolfo and myself are thinking a lot about this curriculum issue, because you are just targeting our way of teaching this. So that's great. So there are many questions here. There are more than 120 people, and there are at least, we have 2 questions here. The first one is Nicolas, about the role of universities, business schools, and scholars. You already answered this question regarding business schools. I know you would like to add something about universities, and then at the personal level, as scholars, what we could do, because you have answered this question at the institutional level for business schools. So we would like to add anything else about these questions?
Well, I mean, universities, I think more generally the same thing applies in the sense that, you know, what is the point of a university? What is its purpose in society? And I think if I look at the way in the UK, I don't know about Argentina, but I think they have become very narrow and very utilitarian. And I think, you know, I would answer the question, say this is all about the intellectual human formation of people to enable people to live their most fulfilled lives. And the best universities do this. They create an environment of exchange, of interaction, and they think about the broad formation of people, the formation of character. And I think if you go down this very narrow path of simply thinking about skills, simply thinking about exams, thinking narrowly about formation, I think it fails. So I think universities have moved more and more and been judged in narrow economic terms, which I think has made it hard to sustain the richness of the breadth of what a university should be doing.
Great. Yeah, you are touching about character formation. Is a very good point. It's just not to miss our mission, and now at the university level. There's another question here, and it goes to the government. Sebastian is talking about, asking you about which role do you conceive for governments in this approach? How can they promote it?
Okay, so that's a great question. I think governments, the best role for government is to provide good regulation and a good legal framework. Then also to send signals through what politicians say to encourage a cultural formation, because this is always a dynamic process. I think in the UK, we've seen examples in the past where the government have tried to nationalize and to get very involved in the private sector. It'll be so interesting to see what happens after the COVID crisis, but usually those examples end in failure because the government is not as good as the market at identifying where resources are best placed. So, but what the government can do is to create a level playing field. It can also make sure that the basis is strong so that people are not exploited, minimum wages, proper health and safety regulation, proper competitive regulations and rules. And in the UK, recently we have new corporate governance rules, which are excellent. What we now need is for business to do it. So I think government has a very important role to play, but it's in the service of creating a market orientated to a broader common good.
Right, so create the condition is what you know very well, the common good, create the condition for business to do their job. There is, okay, someone would like to ask in person, so you can do it.
Yes, it's Karen.
Hello, Karen.
Yeah,
Hi,
sure.
good morning. Thank you. I would like to ask a question. So based on the situation that we are facing right now, where many companies have had to prioritize profit to give continuity to the company, which are your recommendations to minimize or mitigate the impact in the people engagement and also in reputation?
So in the COVID crisis, I mean, in the UK, obviously that's really just the experience I can speak from. It's actually been very interesting. There's been a whole spectrum of corporate responses to it. But one of the things that has surprised many people is the number of companies who have been willing to share burdens. So they have stopped paying dividends. There have been pay cuts for very senior executives. People have given their suppliers. If you look at Unilever, for example, which is one of the best UK companies, but they have been amazing in terms of supporting their smaller suppliers and contractors through the early stages of the crisis. So there's been quite a lot of burden sharing between companies and their main stakeholders. Now, I think as I read that situation now, we're entering only now the very, very hard phase of this, because we've gone through in the UK anyway, we're just coming out of the acute phase, and we're now into the chronic phase, which will take the next 2 to 3 years. And I think at this point, it's all to play for. I think that if you like, the purpose-led mentality, which has become quite powerful in shaping how businesses have responded, I don't know to what extent this will stay, because you will have lots and lots of pressures from investors, also from businesses trying to survive, as you rightly say, Karen. I mean, they've got to survive, but there are different ways in which you can survive, right? If you simply think about short-term profit maximization, you cut costs, you take one route. If you think about a longer route to a purpose-led approach, you may take a different path where you try and do different trade-offs, and you don't immediately think about cost cutting, but you also try and bring people with you, and you debate and you discuss whether or not people would share burdens and accept lower salaries and so on, or work part-time. There are different ways different companies can approach this. And I think although it is going to be very, very difficult for lots of businesses over the next 2 to 3 years, I still think even in difficult situations, businesses have choices about what they're really trying to achieve for the longer term. And they also know that people will not forget. So if they behave in ways that are very exploitative now and ruthless, people will not forget that.
Thank you, Charles. There are many other questions here. Juan Golan, would you like to raise your hand or just to say your question? What happens with social infrastructure?
Okay. You were talking about how to regulate so as to private sector invest in infrastructure and development. But what's your opinion about social infrastructure in developing countries? Do you think that in this aspect, the shared created value core essence has more sense? Or do you think that the state has to intervene directly? I want to know what's your opinion about that point. Thank you.
Yeah. Okay. So that's a great question, Joanna. I have to say I'm not an expert on developing countries' economies and the trade-offs and the best way of thinking about this. But from what I've seen, I would say this, that there are clearly collective action problems that it requires government to lead on and that the market will not meet. And when it comes to social infrastructure, this is often a big thing. And therefore, in that situation, I think governments do have to take a lead and often do have to invest publicly in a way that supports the creation over time of maybe market mechanisms. But equally, I mean, if I just look at health in the UK and social care, we've seen the huge limitations of market-based approaches to these problems. And over the last 30 years, with the conservative government in the 1990s, there was the introduction of a lot of market-based mechanisms in health and social care, which frankly did not work, or did not work anything like as well as they could, as they should have done. So when I've seen that and lived through it, part of me is resistant to the idea that there's I'm certainly resistant to the ideology that says a market-based approach is always the better one. But equally, I've also seen the other side of that, where state-based approaches actually can stifle innovation and are not appropriate. So I mean, I'm not in a position to make a judgment, as you are, as to what the right thing to do is in Argentina and in developing countries where you have real issues of social infrastructure development that have to be met. But my instinct would be you have to let government have a lead and to create the conditions in which then a market-based approach can thrive, but also be very careful about not letting exploitative practices harm people.
So it's Charles, thank you. Just to make reference to your framework, there's a principle of solidarity and then subsidiarity. You are just tapping on subsidiarity just to create the conditions exactly, so people can read your framework. And the solidarity one is just to go where the market cannot go. So as a government, you have a role there. So there is another question, Carolina, would you like to ask you or just read it for you? Carolina Gutierrez.
No, I can ask it. My question was, what are the necessary conditions for a company to transition from a CSR mindset into a core business impact mindset? And if every company is ready for this shift?
Okay. Well, to answer the second one first, no, I don't think every company is ready for this shift, but I think what we can do is to create over time a societal expectation that this is a kind of new normal. So that's how I kind of think about the long-term game here. We need the default to shift. At the moment, the default is still the purpose is to maximize profit. If the default in 10 years' time has shifted, then you may well still have profit maximizing businesses, but people will say, well, why aren't you pursuing a purpose? Why haven't you thought about this? So that's the shift, I think, the default shift. And I think we're in the middle of having a global argument about whether that is possible, and at the early stages of that. So to your first question, what are the conditions? I think there are a number. I think the first is that personally, the CEO of the business is passionate about this and believes personally that this will align better, a better business and a better society. The second condition is that they persuade their leadership team. And that's very important because sometimes even a visionary chief executive can get in their own way and everybody goes along with what they've said because they're the boss, but they don't really agree. If that happens, it won't work. So what you have to do is to create the psychological safety for people to argue. And then once they've argued it out, you need to reach a shared belief, a real belief that people hold on the team, not just the chief executive, but the whole team, that this is good. This is good for the business and good for society. Then when you've done that, then the next thing is to think about how you articulate this, how you then involve the business, involve stakeholders, and articulate what you're doing, and then move ahead. And there are a number of dimensions in which you need to pursue that. I mentioned earlier strategy. Strategy is super important. The end game is, this is our purpose. Because this is our purpose, here is our strategy. And here are the outcomes, financial and non-financial. And you're able to link those back. Then there's also culture. I mentioned earlier about how you think about people. That's all about the culture around people within the organization. How people show up, how they're incentivized, how they're treated, what are the terms and conditions. That's a really important factor as well. Because you can have a good purpose and still be a terrible place to work. And in our view, you need to do both these things together. Then there's also governance. So how is the business governed? To what extent do the board think that purpose is important? Do they shape their oversight of the business around the same thing? So is there coherence between the board and the CEO and the executive team? That's important as well. And then another aspect, which is very difficult, but very important, is how you measure and assess this. How you develop good metrics without being obsessed by metrics, but good metrics that help you tell the story internally and externally about what you're doing.
Great. Listening to you, it seems like you are an academic, a professor. And the great thing here is that you are a practitioner because you are a former partner from KPMG. So
well, I wasn't a partner.
Very nice. but you are talking from an experience, and well, we are thinking about developing a course with Charles and Rodolfo about business as a force for good, because we learn from practitioners and we are in a university context here. So thank you very much for your answer. You are going from the example to the key measures. That's right. So sorry, Frederick, you have a question before Carolina. We'd like to ask the question to Charles directly.
Yeah, sure. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Yes, thank you so much, Héctor. So my main question is, given external shocks, for example, the ongoing and prevalent COVID-19 crisis, how would you really balance CSR measures versus companies' activities focused on survival? And I know that you gave us a very good example before, but I do realize from a European perspective that a lot of SMEs particularly really suffer and are very cash strapped, almost in distress, if you will, and also do not get a lot of government support. So how do you really balance what's happening here?
Yeah, well, it's a great question, and it's not easy, and I don't think there's a kind of straightforward answer to this because it's so dependent on the particular business and what they're having to do. But if you go back to if you start at the beginning and say, okay, you know, I'm an SME, so why am I in business? I've set up some restaurants. So what do I want to do? I want to have a thriving restaurant business that gives people a great experience through my 5 restaurants, and I want to employ people and for them to feel that they want to be part of the team and that we're all doing well. So, okay. So I have a purpose around giving people a great experience through fantastic food in my restaurants. And then I'm hit by COVID. So if my intuition is to want to keep the business going and to care for people, I'd share burdens. I'm very open with people about the problem. I'm completely transparent about the financial situation. And I say, okay, so I go to the government and say, would you furlough people, please? They furlough them. And now maybe I have a business or I don't, because in the UK, we have the 2-meter rule. It could be a year or 18 months. So I may have to close some of my restaurants. Maybe I've got 4, maybe I think I need to go it down to 2. The only led way of doing that is to just be honest and face into the issues with and alongside people. I think that the distinction I would make is between somebody who just doesn't consult people at all and takes a short-term route to profit maximization, versus somebody who says, no, I want to create a thriving business and I want to keep the relationships as good as I can while I go through this. And we all know if people are honest and they explain a situation, even if somebody has to be made redundant or lose their job, if they understand why, it's not a problem. This happens all the time in business. But the big difference is whether people feel treated fairly, they're being dealt with honestly, whether the business is really trying to build for the future, or whether people just believe they're being misled or used or exploited. And we all know, we can make this distinction all the time. It doesn't depend on whether businesses are doing well or badly. It's entirely a matter of the attitude and mental mindset of the people running the company. So yes, I mean, so government support will help in this situation. But the way I think about it is that it's about the core business. So I try and get away from this idea that there's business over here and CSR, corporate social responsibility, somewhere else. I forget CSR. It's, we need to just forget it altogether and just think about the core business. What's the core business doing and how is that benefiting society? And how do we think about all the relationships within the business in those terms?
Thank you so much. Very, very good answer.
Thank you. Then we have Valentina. I would like to ask Charles your question directly about the role of not-for-profit.
Okay. Hi, Charles. What is the role of non-profit organizations in this approach? Because sometimes I work in a non-profit organization, and usually we try to convince the companies to help us. But if we are trying to change it to a purpose approach, can we help them work on that, on those purposes, and work together to help them see the necessities, the social needs that maybe they can approach now?
Yeah. Okay, so that's a great question too. I mean, the way I think of this is that if companies adopt a purpose-led approach, it changes the relationship between non-profits and companies. Because what happens is you then say, okay, so we have a society in which there are needs that the market will meet. And the private sector is meeting those needs orientated to serving the wider common good of society. Then there are a whole bunch of needs that the market can't meet. So we need not-for-profits, we need charities, and they are not, sitting above companies, because the previous world was one where the companies have all the money and the not-for-profits have all the morality. And they say, give us some of your money so we can do good things because you're just doing bad things. And actually we need to rebalance this and to say, no, we can have a society in which business as much as not-for-profits are also orientated towards the good. But actually what we need is a relationship where they work in partnership, where there isn't a market solution to a problem and where the NGO cannot sort it by itself. And this is where really powerful partnerships between non-for-profits and businesses are now forming. But it's on a different basis, i.e. where the purpose spurs a conversation about how you can work together to meet needs that neither can meet by themselves. And this is really powerful, I think. The other thing I would say about having worked for most of my life actually in the not-for-profit world is that I think the provocation around purpose applies just as much to not-for-profits as it does to businesses. I'll give you one example, a homeless charity I was working with. The chief executive to me, she said, Charles, we're supposed to be running a campaign for the homeless. I said, yes. She said, it isn't. It's a home for campaigners. So the whole charity, in her view, had become inverted because they were raising money to pay for the jobs, to raise the money for the jobs. And they'd forgotten about why they were there. So she said this purpose challenge to the charity was as important as the purpose challenges to business.
Right. You're talking a great point here is about the private-public cooperation and the civil society as well. But let's move to Rodolfo has a questions to you, and then we'll move on to the other questions in the chat. Rodolfo.
Yes, okay. Charles, my question is related to this COVID-19 wreck. Is this an opportunity to boost this purpose-led approach?
Yes.
Or are we going back 10 years because businesses are going to really focus on profit center or not losing profit center mindset? What do you think about it?
Yeah, well, I think that's the $64,000 question. I very much hope it will be the first, but like you, I don't have a crystal ball. Why do I am cautiously hopeful that this will happen. I think one reason is that people saw what happened after the financial crisis, and they saw that the losses were socialized and the gains were privatized. and the private sector came out of the financial crisis and carried on delivering profits, and we had widening inequality in society. And certainly in the UK, there are many, many people who say we do not want that again. And the second thing is, I think that this purpose movement is much more mature than it was after the financial crisis. And for the reasons I gave in my opening remarks, I think there are good reasons for that. And I think the generation of employees in businesses now, people in their 20s and 30s, most of you listening to this webinar, are putting big pressure on businesses. And they don't want to work for businesses that just maximize profits for shareholders and don't care about people. And it's very striking if you see what's been happening in the big tech companies, the ways in which employees in Facebook have been objecting to some of the things the company's been doing, and Amazon as well. And I think, and certainly in the UK, after the Black Lives Matter protests, you have a lot of pressure from within the employees of companies who have powerful. I mean, they have a lot of power, right? Because in the economy we have now, it's a knowledge economy, and an awful lot of the value of these businesses is their people. So they cannot ignore their employees. And I think that is going to be one of the biggest single things actually that pushes business to behave better coming out of this crisis than it did after the last one.
Okay, great. So we have 5 more questions, 10 minutes more or less. So I will go to the next one. It's Enrique, we would like to ask this question about the corruption rationale in the government.
Yes, yes. With this idea of creating a strategy, we think that the relationship with NGOs is sometimes is okay, but the relationship with the government in our countries, in developing countries, implies a certain amount of corruption, and that's why maybe our goals as a company or our purpose is not fulfilled correctly. How you think that in UK or how in UK you manage that? Because I think the corruption is an international virtue of everyone.
Yeah, it's a great question, and I'd love to know your sort of thoughts on this as well, because I don't have a kind of a ready answer to you. I mean, just to reflect a bit on some of the conversations we've had with companies that have had corruption issues themselves, because as you rightly say, it's not, this is a global phenomenon, and in these global businesses that we're working with, they have issues. I mean, some of the things that have really helped have been where big multinational companies have taken a very clear public stand, supported by local legislation. So the Anti-Bribery Act, the US Foreign Corrupt Practices Act. I remember talking to the chairman of Shell, who said that they'd closed down a whole set of operations in Nigeria at a big cost, because he said, we cannot guarantee, we cannot work in this area without having to pay so many, whatever the word is, commission payments, however you characterize the word. But he said, we can't operate because it's so endemic. So we're not going to be here. He said, if we have this principle as a global business, we simply have to lose the profit. That's the only way of doing it. So that's one extreme approach. And I think what without question helps is openness and transparency within organizations. And the fear of being found out, the openness with which people disclose what they're doing is a big part of it. And I think also calling it out where it happens and having a public debate about what the implications of it are, even if it's very difficult to change in the short term, seems to me to be a really important part of what needs to happen in a society if it's going to be addressed. But I say that with aware that it's a really, really difficult problem where you have entrenched expectations and you have systems which are inherently corrupt, and then it becomes very hard.
Right. Thank you, Charles. You are going from business to the government NGOs, so well, broad knowledge you are sharing with us. There is another question about Lola Garreton, the current standard for assessing what companies do, but Lola, would you like to explain a little more, or just with the question is enough?
No, it's like, what's the standard for assessing what companies do to become like purpose driven? Like, is it integrated reporting or is it up to each company? And do you think that those metrics that they use in the UK might be useful for companies in a developing country like Argentina?
Well, thank you, Lola. That's a great question too. So I think the answer is there isn't a metric. But actually, let me tell you, I don't think that's a bad thing, because I think we live in a world which is obsessed with data. And we tend to think there's a data answer to every question. And there is not a data answer to every question. And if you ask how your relationship with your best friend, you don't immediately reach for a number and say it's a 3 today. But we tend in business constantly to think that there must be a way of reducing and measuring the things that matter in terms of numbers. And I think this is something we have to recognize as a kind of cultural problem, because it is a cultural problem. One of the people who helped found Blueprint has a great phrase. She says, what counts is what gets counted, but what really counts can't be counted. And that's the problem. I talked at the beginning about human relationships, the quality of human relationships. These are fundamental in life, and they are in business as well. And you can't measure them, not directly. You can measure them indirectly, but you can't measure them directly. So I think what we need to do is to recognize the limits of measures, to think about why we want to measure something. So what is going to be the better conversation as a result of our having some insight into this? And then thinking about what form of measurement will best enable us to do that. And also not just thinking about narrative measures, but also quantitative measures, but qualitative assessments as well. Although I realize they can be easily manipulated just as numbers can be manipulated. But we've seen, you know, there are lots and lots of ways. My wife used to work in the NHS as a hospital manager. And when, under the previous Labour government, there was a 4-hour target for waiting times, what happened was that people would take the wheels off the bottom of the trolleys, because if somebody was waiting over 4 hours in an accident and emergency, the 4 hours was the limit. If you take the wheels off the trolleys, they're not in a trolley anymore, they're in a bed. So they've met the target. So, so there's just an example of how a focus on targets and measures can just lead to perverse behavior. But I mean, it's a hugely important area, and we are working with others. There are very good measures that have been developed. SASB is one which is being used by BlackRock and others about non-financial measures and materiality. And we're engaged in some of these conversations. But as a charity, one of the things we're doing is saying, just hold on about what you, and be very careful about trying to assume that you can measure more than you can measure.
Right, this is for a book, because you are talking about intentions and how can you measure these intentions and convictions. So great to continue this conversation. You had the last 3 questions. We started 10 minutes later, so I will just give room to the last 3 questions. One is from Luis Aguirre, who would like to ask the question to Charles directly. Companies' charities are paid by stockholders. What do you think about? That's the question.
Sorry, what is the question?
Companies' charities are paid by stockholders. What do you think about?
They're all paid by stock. Well, okay, so the question is, what is the role of investors and stockholders? Are they? I'm not entirely sure.
I know Luis is here, but I imagine that because stockholders are driven by the profit capitalism, but then at the same time are putting money in charities. So how is this relationship about the purple LEDs? And I think it could be something like that. But if Luis is not adding anything, so it's just this question. We can move to the other one.
Well, okay, well, I'm not quite sure what the point is Luis is driving at, but it's perfectly true that often investors are fully philanthropic and with one side of their heads and very profit focused on another. Sometimes, in fact, as a charity, we're funded by some individuals who are wealthy, and that's a conversation I tend to have with some of them about why it is that they are very narrowly focused with one side of their brain on making money, and also very charitable with the other side of their brain, rather than thinking about bringing these 2 things together. And that would be my only comment on that.
Okay, great. The other question is David Wilson. Would you like to ask the question to Charles directly?
Thanks,
about
Héctor.
venture capitalism.
Yeah, thanks, Charles. Thanks for this amazing talk. My question is more related to startups. What do you think about the VCs, venture capital mindset? Do you think that they are considering this new approach when they decide to invest in a company? How do you try, with your experience, how do you try to convince them to invest in a lower profitable company with a better social impact instead of invest in a company more profitable with a better return of capital?
Well, it's a good question, David. I mean, I'm not that experienced in this. We've done a bit of, one of my trustees has been running a startup with venture capital. So I've been talking to her and one or two other people, but it's not an area where we play as a charity. But my observation would be, what I've seen is fantastic purpose-led businesses being started and growing quite quickly, and then reaching the point where they have a conversation with venture capital who say, okay, you've done wonderfully so far. Now let me tell you how it works from here on. And the things they want to change are often the very things that created the brilliant business in the first place. And so that sometimes is a real issue, where you get a narrow focus on short-term profitability in return for investment, which can, or risks, killing or undermining the very value that was established at the start of the business and help it to grow to where it's become. And I do see that as a problem that needs to be addressed. But having said that, there are a whole range of different investors that certainly in the UK landscape. So venture capital does not come in one size. You have people who are impact investing, you have people who are very focused on social value investing, who also are increasingly realizing that there isn't necessarily a trade-off between long-term profitability and social value creation. And I think that's part of what's also going on now in this maturing discourse within business and within the investment community about how businesses think about the broad evaluation of the social value that they create, not just the financial returns that they provide to their investors, and also what the investors want. Because if you're standing behind even venture capital as somebody's pension savings, and what do most pensioners and savers want? Well, they want a decent return, but they also want a decent society in which to live. So these two things coming through the investment chain, I think over time will help push this.
Great. Thank you, Charles. Last question. So it's about these labor unions. So Gaston, you would like to ask the question to Charles directly?
Yes. Hi, Charles. As long as I know, countries like UK have strong labor unions, and I would like to know if they represent any problem while you're trying to achieve your purpose, or if you can imagine labor unions and social movements working as a team with you. I don't know if you...
Yeah, thank you. Thank you, Gaston. Okay, that's a very interesting question. The answer is we have a good dialogue in the UK to pick your last point first, with the TUC, the Trades Union Congress. And in fact, the leader of it has spoken at several of our conferences. I mean, the UK, interestingly now, after COVID, is becoming a bit more unionized again. But over the last 20, 30 years, the power of the trade unions in the UK context has gone down. And most large companies have a low unionized workforce. But also, what part of the problem in the UK is a history of poor relations between managers and unions. And they're often very confrontational and ideologically driven by a split between capital and labor. And part of what our blueprints approach is to try and reset the dialogue and say, can we think of these not as in Marxist terms as essentially a power conflict between estranged interests, but can we see this in human terms as a relationship between those who provide capital and who are there to safeguard that, and those who are providing labor and able to come together in a fair way. So I think, and what's interesting is that if you again look at COVID, the unions in the UK have been very powerful recently in arguing with employers about health and safety equipment, what is safe, when it is safe to go back to work. So they've actually come up again, having been a bit eclipsed over the last few years in the context of this crisis. And I think the UK would benefit by having a much better less conflicted relationship between unions and government. But the cultural history is not good in the UK for this. And so I think attitudes and assumptions need to change on both sides.
Well, thank you, Charles. You have answered all the questions. No more questions. We are more than 15. So that's great. I will just end up this webinar with Rodolfo. I don't know if you would like to have some highlights regarding the webinar, and then I will just for my close.
No, it was very, very interesting. I took a lot of notes. It's interesting that we are taking some of the topics as a business school. Just for you to know, Charles, last year we helped at IAE in a research center to make a dialogue between the automotive unions and also the 6 terminals that are here in Argentina in order to promote a new law and a new strategic plan for the next 10 years. Before some changes that happen in government and also with the COVID. But I think there is plenty of opportunity from our school. I took a lot of notes and I thank you a lot, and I leave Héctor for closing. Thank you very much, Charles.
Thank you, Rodolfo.
Well, thank you, Rodolfo. Well, the goal was to have a conversation and to have a time for reflection and a call to action. I think this purpose was achieved in this webinar. Thank you, Charles, for your generosity as always and your professionalism and example. And then to Rodolfo for your courage to ask difficult questions, because the 4th question, you invented that question. So it's interesting to put the challenge there in the table. Thank you for doing that. And then to our team that make this webinar possible. And then to all of you, because I am amazed about the 120 people or more constantly attended here, and then the thoughtful questions, and then the great communication in English. I think, Charles, maybe surprised you because you expect a different thing, but they would like to take the microphone. That's why instead of reading the questions, I gave the microphone to them. So thank you all. Let's continue this conversation, and then I will send in the chat, I will put an email where you can send some notes or more ideas. Just for the sake of time, I haven't mentioned that Charles is one of the key influential leaders in the world, together with people like Jay Cohen from B Lab, B Corps, or also Christian Felber, the Economy of Common Good, or other key people we interview in a paper together with other colleagues. And I think this conversation should continue because things are changing. So thank you very much to all. I will just put the email here so that you can send us your thoughts. Till next time.
Okay.
Just
well, thank you. Just to say thank you, Héctor, thank you, Rodolfo, and thank you all very much. It's a pleasure to meet you all, and good luck with your studies. And if you want to be in touch with Blueprint, you know where we are, and delighted to continue a conversation with any of you. Okay.
Thank you very much.
That's a pleasure.
See you.
Bye.
Pleasure. Thank you. Bye-bye. Estamos recibiendo muchos agradecimientos. We are receiving a lot of thanks to you, Charles and Rodolfo. So we can continue then our conversation to do a wrap up. So Marcela, you are just stopping the videotaping, and then we can continue just as a wrap up. A conversation with Rodolfo and Charles in 2 minutes. Is that possible?
Perfect. Yes, don't worry.
Is that possible? Just to keep the link, or maybe we are just stopping here and then go to the link again.
Yeah, maybe we can close it and then we can open it again. ¿No, Marce?
Okay. Okay, let's do that and, and reconvene here.
Va a ser lo mejor.
Yes, in 2 minutes. Thank you very much. See you then.
Thank you. ¿Va a estar otro link, Marce?